Imagine a single building that held the sum of human knowledge, not just history and philosophy, but the blueprints of stars, the secrets of medicine, the lost plays of Sophocles, and the forgotten histories of entire civilizations. This was not a dream. It was the Great Library of Alexandria, the intellectual heartbeat of the ancient world. For centuries, it was a beacon, drawing the greatest minds to its hallowed halls. But this beacon was extinguished. Its destruction was not a single event, but a slow, tragic decay, a death by 1,000 cuts from war, fire, and fanaticism. The loss of the library wasn't just the burning of scrolls, it was the erasure of memory, the silencing of genius. We live in the shadow of that loss, piecing together a past from the fragments that survived. This is the story of what was lost, how it was lost, and the enduring quest to reclaim a world of forgotten wisdom. Before it was a library, it was a dream born in the mind of a man who sought to conquer the world not just with swords, but with ideas. Alexander the Great, the student of Aristotle, was more than a brilliant military strategist. He was a visionary who saw a future where cultures did not simply clash, but blended. As his armies marched across Persia and towards the edges of the known world, he carried with him a profound respect for knowledge, instilled by the greatest philosopher of his age. Aristotle had taught him to observe, to question, and to collect. This was the seed from which the Library of Alexandria would grow. In 331 BCE, on a narrow strip of land between a lake and the Mediterranean Sea, Alexander founded the city that would bear his name. His vision for Alexandria was not merely a strategic port or a new capital, but a cosmopolitan hub, a crossroads for the entire world. He imagined a place where the wisdom of Greece would meet the ancient knowledge of Egypt, Persia, and beyond. It was to be a beacon of Hellenistic culture, shining its light across his vast new empire. He planned its grand avenues, its temples, and its royal palaces. But central to this vision was a place for scholars, a sanctuary for the muses, where all human knowledge could be gathered and studied. It was an ambition as vast as his empire. Alexander envisioned an institution that would house not just Greek philosophy and poetry, but every scroll, every tablet, every fragment of learning from every civilization his armies encountered. It was a conqueror's approach to scholarship, to possess the world's intellectual treasures just as he possessed its lands and its gold. However, fate is often indifferent to the plans of even the greatest men. Alexander's life was cut short before he could see his intellectual capital fully rise from the coastal sands. He left behind a fractured empire and a city whose destiny was uncertain. The dream of a universal library, a place that would hold the collective memory of humanity, now rested in the hands of his successors. The question was, would any of them share his monumental vision, or would the conqueror's greatest dream fade away with him? Alexander's empire was torn apart by his generals, each carving out a kingdom for himself. Egypt, the richest prize, fell to Ptolemy, a shrewd and loyal commander who had fought beside Alexander since the beginning. Crowned pharaoh, Ptolemy I Soter, the savior, understood that true power was not maintained by force alone. To legitimize his new Greek dynasty in an ancient land, he needed to establish cultural supremacy. He needed to make Alexandria the undisputed center of the Hellenistic world, surpassing even Athens. To do this, he resurrected Alexander's grandest idea. Ptolemy was no mere soldier. He was a man of letters, an author of a history of Alexander's campaigns. He knew the value of knowledge and propaganda. He invited Demetrius of Phaleron, an exiled Athenian statesman and a student from Aristotle's own school, to his court. It was a brilliant strategic move. Demetrius was the architect of the dream, the man who provided the blueprint for turning a conqueror's ambition into a functioning institution. He advised Ptolemy that a library containing every book in the world would bring immense prestige and attract the greatest minds. This was the birth of the Mouseion, the shrine of the Muses, and at its heart, the Great Library. The project became a state-funded obsession. This was not a private collection, but a public works project on an unprecedented scale, funded by the immense wealth of the Ptolemaic kingdom. The goal was nothing less than intellectual monopoly. Ptolemy I laid the foundation, but it was his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who truly brought the vision to life. A passionate bibliophile, he poured state resources into the library, driven by a fierce rivalry with other Hellenistic kings, particularly the Attalid dynasty of Pergamum, who were building their own impressive library. Under Ptolemy II, the library's collection swelled from thousands of scrolls to tens of thousands. He established a scriptorium for copying and a workshop for repairs. He sent agents across the Mediterranean with royal funds, tasked with acquiring texts on every conceivable subject. The Ptolemaic dynasty had transformed Alexander's dream into a family legacy, a symbol of their power and intellect. They were no longer just rulers of Egypt. They were the self-appointed guardians of human knowledge, and their ambition knew no bounds. The Library of Alexandria was not one building, but a sprawling complex, a testament to the scale of the Ptolemies' ambition. The main institution, the Great Library, was part of the royal palace grounds in the Bruchaion, the Greek quarter of the city. We can only imagine its grandeur based on ancient descriptions. Picture long, colonnaded walkways of gleaming marble, connecting lecture halls, dining commons, and serene reading rooms. Sunlight would have streamed in, illuminating shelves stacked high with the wisdom of the world. These were not books as we know them, but thousands upon thousands of papyrus scrolls, each carefully labeled with a clay tag indicating its author and title. The sheer logistics of such an undertaking were staggering. A single work, like Homer's Iliad, might require 24 scrolls. The collection quickly outgrew its original space. To accommodate the overflow and to make knowledge accessible to a wider audience, a second, daughter library was established at the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, located in another part of the city. This branch alone was said to have housed over 40,000 scrolls. But the library was more than just a repository. It was a dynamic center for scholarship. A large staff of scribes, editors, and restorers worked tirelessly. They meticulously copied incoming texts, creating a master version for the archive and a second copy for lending or trade. They compared different versions of the same work, trying to establish the most authentic text, a practice that formed the basis of modern textual criticism. Perhaps the most monumental task was organization. How do you find a single scroll among hundreds of thousands? The answer came from the poet and scholar Callimachus. He created the Pinakes, or tables, a comprehensive catalog of the library's holdings. It was a 120-volume work that listed authors alphabetically, provided a short biography, and cataloged all their known works, even noting the first words of each text to ensure its identity. The Pinakes was more than a list. It was the world's first systematic library catalog and a foundational map of Greek literature. It organized the entirety of human thought into categories: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, and natural science. Through marble halls and methodical catalogs, the Ptolemies were not just collecting scrolls. They were building an organized, accessible, and enduring mind for the entire world. The Ptolemaic rulers were not content to wait for the world's knowledge to come to them. They launched an aggressive, state-sponsored hunt for every scroll ever written, employing methods that were both ingenious and coercive. Royal agents with full purses were dispatched to book markets from Rhodes to Athens, tasked with buying any text of value. Their primary mission was to acquire the oldest and most authentic copies possible, especially of cornerstone works like those of Homer, Plato, and the great tragedians. But the royal appetite for scrolls was insatiable, and soon more forceful tactics were employed. Ptolemy III. Euergetes issued a remarkable decree. Any ship that docked in Alexandria's bustling harbor had to surrender its books. The scrolls were taken to the library, where scribes would swiftly create high-quality copies on fresh papyrus. The new copy was then returned to the ship's owner, while the original manuscript was kept for the royal collection, marked in the catalogue as "From the Ships." This policy, while controversial, rapidly expanded the library's holdings with texts from every corner of the Mediterranean. Perhaps the most famous and audacious acquisition story concerns the official state copies of the plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These master copies were a national treasure of Athens, guarded closely. Ptolemy III formally requested to borrow them for copying, offering an enormous deposit of silver, 15 talents, a fortune at the time, as a guarantee of their safe return. The Athenians, swayed by the immense sum, agreed. They waited, but the original scrolls never came back. Instead, Ptolemy sent back beautifully made copies, choosing to forfeit his entire silver deposit. He valued the authentic texts more than the fortune. This obsessive quest extended to translation. Ptolemy II Philadelphus commissioned the first ever Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. According to legend, 72 scholars were brought to Alexandria and isolated to work on the project, which became known as the Septuagint. It was a monumental effort to ensure that the wisdom of the Jewish people was included in the great Hellenistic repository. This relentless hunt, fueled by royal ego and intellectual ambition, turned the library into a global magnet for information. It was a dragnet cast across the sea, pulling in every story, every poem, every scientific treatise, and every philosophical argument, creating a collection whose scale and diversity the world had never seen and may never see again. The Great Library was the heart of a much larger organism, the Mouseion. This was not merely a library, but the ancient world's first and greatest research institute, a prototype for the modern university. Established by Ptolemy I, the Mouseion was a true temple of the Muses, a place where the arts and sciences were pursued with religious devotion. Its members were a community of up to 100 leading scholars, poets, and scientists, all hand-picked from across the Greek-speaking world. The Mouseion was a scholar's paradise. The Ptolemaic state provided its members with generous salaries, tax exemptions, free lodging, and meals in a grand communal dining hall. They had no formal teaching requirements. Their only duty was to think, to research, to debate, and to push the boundaries of human understanding. Freed from the daily concerns of making a living, these great minds could dedicate their entire lives to their work. The campus included not only the library, but also lecture halls, botanical gardens, a zoological park with exotic animals, an astronomical observatory, and even rooms for medical dissection and study. It was a self-contained world of intellectual discovery. Within these hallowed halls, breakthroughs that would shape civilization for millennia took place. Euclid, a resident scholar, wrote his Elements, the foundational text of geometry that would remain the standard for over 2,000 years. The head librarian, Eratosthenes, a brilliant polymath, calculated the circumference of the Earth with astounding accuracy, using little more than shadows, wells, and geometry. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, suggesting the Earth revolved around the Sun nearly 2 millennia before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria built early steam engines and automata, exploring principles of mechanics that were centuries ahead of their time. The Mouseion was a crucible where different fields of knowledge met and mingled. Mathematicians conversed with poets, and astronomers debated with philosophers. It was here that the literary canon of ancient Greece was standardized, and the scientific method was refined. The library provided the raw material, the accumulated knowledge of the past, while the mouseion provided the intellectual engine to process it into the knowledge of the future. It was this powerful synergy that made Alexandria the undisputed intellectual capital of the world, a shining beacon whose light would guide humanity for centuries to come. Within the serene colonnades of the mouseion, the scholars of Alexandria were undertaking a task of breathtaking ambition, to measure and map the entire known world and the heavens beyond. This was not merely philosophy, it was science, built on observation, mathematics, and a revolutionary spirit of inquiry. The head librarian in the 3rd century BCE, a polymath named Eratosthenes, became legendary for an experiment of stunning simplicity and genius. He had heard that on the summer solstice in the southern city of Siene, the sun shone directly down a deep well, casting no shadow. He knew that on the same day in Alexandria, a vertical stick did cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of that shadow, he reasoned he could calculate the curvature of the earth. Using the distance between the two cities, he performed his calculations and arrived at a figure for the planet's circumference. His result was astonishingly accurate, off by only a small percentage from what modern satellites have confirmed. For the first time, humanity had a true sense of the scale of its own world. Eratosthenes then used this knowledge to create the first global map incorporating lines of latitude and longitude, a conceptual grid that would form the basis of all cartography to come. While he mapped the earth, others looked upward. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a radical idea, one that would be dismissed for nearly 2,000 years. He suggested that the earth was not the center of the universe. Instead, he argued, the earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. This heliocentric model was too profound a leap for his contemporaries, who remained bound to a geocentric view. Yet, the seed of a cosmic truth was planted in the library's scrolls. Perhaps the greatest of Alexandria's astronomers was Hipparchus. Working in the 2nd century BCE, he meticulously catalogued the positions and brightness of over 850 stars, creating the first comprehensive star chart in history. Through his painstaking observations, he discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, gradual wobble of the Earth's axis. He developed trigonometry to aid his calculations and could predict solar and lunar eclipses with remarkable precision. From the size of the planet to the layout of the stars, the scholars of Alexandria were replacing myth with measurement. They were using logic and mathematics to decode the cosmos, revealing a universe far grander and more orderly than anyone had ever imagined. This precious knowledge, inscribed on fragile papyrus, represented a new understanding of humanity's place in the universe, an understanding that was as brilliant as it was vulnerable. While some scholars in Alexandria looked to the stars, others looked inward, to the abstract world of pure reason. They sought a universal language to describe the fundamental structure of reality, a code built not on observation, but on logic itself. The master of this domain was a quiet, enigmatic mathematician named Euclid, who worked in Alexandria around 300 BCE. His contribution was not a single new discovery, but something far more profound, a complete systemization of all known mathematics, presented in his 13-book masterpiece, The Elements. The Elements is arguably the most influential textbook ever written. It begins with a simple set of 23 definitions, 5 postulates, and 5 common notions. Foundational truths so self-evident they required no proof. A point is that which has no part. A line is a breadthless length. All right angles are equal. From this handful of starting blocks, Euclid proceeded to build the entire edifice of geometry, step by logical step. Each new proposition was proven using only the axioms and previously proven propositions. This rigorous, axiomatic method was his true genius. It was a new way of thinking, a blueprint for constructing complex arguments from simple, unassailable truths. The book methodically moves from basic plane geometry to solid geometry, number theory, and the properties of irrational numbers. It was a complete intellectual universe, perfect, internally consistent, and timeless. For over 2,000 years, Euclid's Elements was the bedrock of mathematical education. It shaped the minds of countless thinkers, from Archimedes and Ptolemy to Kepler, Newton, and Einstein. Abraham Lincoln famously studied it to hone his skills in logical argument. The work demonstrated that from a few simple rules, immense complexity and beauty could arise. It taught generations that the universe was not random or capricious, but governed by underlying principles that could be understood through pure reason. This pursuit of abstract knowledge for its own sake was the epitome of the library's mission. It was not about building a better aqueduct or a more efficient war machine. It was about the fundamental human desire to understand. The perfect logical world Euclid constructed on papyrus stood in stark contrast to the messy, unpredictable world of human affairs. While his theorems were eternal, the institution that nurtured them was not. The world of logic offered a comforting certainty, but outside the library's walls, the far less predictable forces of ambition and rivalry were beginning to gather, threatening the very sanctuary where such thought was possible. For generations, Alexandria had enjoyed an undisputed monopoly on knowledge. Its library was the world's intellectual heart, its scholars the brightest minds of the age. But such dominance could not last forever. In the kingdom of Pergamum, located in modern-day Turkey, a new dynasty, the Attalids, rose to power with grand ambitions. They sought to challenge Alexandria not on the battlefield, but in the cultural arena. Their goal was to build a library and a center for learning that would rival, and perhaps even surpass, the great institution of the Ptolemies. Thus began one of the ancient world's most intense intellectual rivalries. The establishment of the Library of Pergamum in the 2nd century BCE ignited a fierce competition for resources. This was a battle fought not with swords, but with scrolls. Agents from both Alexandria and Pergamum scoured the Mediterranean, competing to purchase the rarest texts. Prices for old manuscripts soared. The Ptolemies, protective of their status, became aggressive. They were known to seize any books found on ships docking in Alexandria's harbor, keeping the originals and returning only hastily made copies to their owners. The rivalry extended to people as well. Scholars were the superstars of their day, and the two libraries engaged in a bidding war for the best poets, grammarians, and scientists, offering lavish stipends and prestigious positions. The conflict reached a peak when, according to the Roman writer Varro, Ptolemy V of Egypt decided to cripple his competitor by cutting off its most vital supply. He declared an embargo on the export of papyrus, the plant that grew almost exclusively in the Nile Delta and was the primary writing material of the era. Without papyrus, the Library of Pergamum could not grow. It was an act of intellectual sabotage. But innovation is often born of necessity. Faced with this crisis, the scholars of Pergamum perfected a new writing surface made from treated animal hides. It was smoother, stronger, and more durable than papyrus. It could be folded and written on both sides, leading to the development of the codex, the ancestor of the modern book. This new material became known as Pergamena Charta, or parchment, named after the city that pioneered its use. While this rivalry was driven by politics and pride, it had a beneficial side effect. It created a second great repository of ancient knowledge, ensuring that more texts were copied and preserved. But it also proved that knowledge was no longer just a noble pursuit. It was a form of political currency, a tool in the great game of empires. And a new, formidable power was rising in the West, an empire that would soon cast its shadow over both Pergamum and Alexandria. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the golden age of the Ptolemies was fading. The dynasty was weakened by internal conflict, a shadow of its former glory. Into this volatile political landscape stepped two of history's most compelling figures, their meeting a collision of two worlds. One was Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was not merely the siren of Roman propaganda, but a formidable intellectual, a direct product of the culture of the Mausion. Fluent in at least 9 languages, she was well versed in mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy. She was a brilliant strategist and a ruthless politician, determined to restore the power of her kingdom. The other was Gaius Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. A military genius and a masterful politician, he represented a new world order, one built on military might and pragmatism. In 48 BCE, Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival, Pompey. He found himself in the middle of a bitter civil war between Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. The legendary story of their first encounter speaks volumes. Barred from the palace by her brother's forces, Cleopatra had herself smuggled inside, famously rolled up in a carpet or linen sack, and delivered directly to Caesar. It was a bold, theatrical move designed to capture the attention of a man who appreciated audacity. Their connection was immediate and multifaceted. It was a passionate affair, but also a calculated political and military alliance. Cleopatra needed Caesar's legions to defeat her brother and secure her throne. Caesar, in turn, needed Egypt's immense wealth to pay his armies and consolidate his power in Rome. He was the sword, and she was the treasury. During his months in Alexandria, Caesar, a man of great curiosity, would have been exposed to the wonders of the library and Mausion. He would have walked the same halls as Euclid and Eratosthenes. He consulted with the Alexandrian astronomer Sophocles, whose expertise was instrumental in Caesar's later reform of the Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would be used for centuries. This was the ultimate fusion of Alexandrian knowledge and Roman power. But this potent alliance provoked a furious reaction. The forces loyal to Cleopatra's brother were outraged by the Roman general's intervention and the queen's apparent submission to a foreign power. They laid siege to the royal palace quarter where Caesar and Cleopatra were staying. The greatest city of the ancient world became a battlefield, and the Great Library, the repository of centuries of human thought, stood perilously close to the center of the storm. The year is 48 BCE. Alexandria is a city at war with itself. Julius Caesar, his legions, and his ally Queen Cleopatra are trapped in the royal quarter, besieged by the much larger army of Ptolemy XIII. The harbor is a web of hostile ships, cutting off any chance of escape or reinforcement. Caesar, ever the decisive commander, makes a bold and desperate move. To break the naval blockade and prevent the enemy fleet from being used against him, he orders his soldiers to set them ablaze. It was a brutal but effective military tactic. Fire, however, is an indiscriminate weapon. Fanned by the strong Mediterranean winds, the flames did not stop at the Egyptian ships. They leaped across the water to the wooden docks, which ignited like tinder. From there, the inferno spread into the city itself, consuming the warehouses and commercial buildings that lined the bustling waterfront. A catastrophic fire engulfed a significant part of Alexandria. For centuries, this event has been cited as the day the Great Library burned, the moment when humanity's collected knowledge went up in smoke. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing a century later, claimed that 400,000 scrolls were destroyed in the blaze. But the truth is more complex and less certain. Caesar himself, in his own detailed account of the Alexandrian War, never mentions the destruction of the library. Such a monumental loss would surely have been noted, either as a tragic accident or as propaganda against his enemies. Most modern historians now believe that the main library, situated safely within the Mousillon complex further inland from the palace, likely survived this fire largely unscathed. What did burn, however, were warehouses located near the port. These buildings were used to store manuscripts, possibly as an overflow collection from the main library, or as scrolls intended for export. The loss was still immense. Tens of thousands of scrolls, works of literature, science, and history, were turned to ash. It was a devastating blow, a wound from which the institution might never fully recover. This fire was not the work of barbarians seeking to erase knowledge. It was a tragic consequence of political ambition, an accident of war. It was the first major physical damage inflicted upon the library, a stark and terrifying reminder that the sanctuary of the mind was not immune to the conflicts of the world. The fire of 48 BCE was not the final end of the Library of Alexandria, but it marked the end of its undisputed golden age. A long, slow decline had begun, and the greatest repository of ancient wisdom had just received its first grievous injury. In the twilight of Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, a grand gesture seemed to promise a new dawn for the Great Library. Around 41 BCE, the Roman general Mark Antony, captivated by Queen Cleopatra, presented her with an extraordinary gift, an estimated 200,000 scrolls taken from the Great Library of Pergamum in modern-day Turkey. This was not merely a lover's offering, it was a strategic deposit of intellectual capital, a reinforcement of Alexandria's status as the world's scholarly heart. The influx of texts was monumental, replacing many of the volumes lost during Julius Caesar's accidental fire decades earlier. It was a moment of profound hope, a sign that even under the growing shadow of Rome, the flame of knowledge in Alexandria would continue to burn brightly. But this gift was wrapped in the complexities of Roman politics. Antony's gesture was also a power play, a way to solidify his alliance with Cleopatra and bolster his eastern power base against his rival, Octavian. The library was once again a pawn in the games of empires. The hope, however, was tragically short-lived. The decisive Battle of Actium in 31 BCE sealed the fate of Antony and Cleopatra, and with them, the independence of Egypt. When Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, marched into Alexandria, he ushered in a new era. Egypt was no longer a kingdom with a powerful queen as a patron of learning. It was now a province, the personal breadbasket of the Roman emperor. The center of gravity, political, cultural, and intellectual, began a slow but inexorable shift westward to Rome. The imperial patronage that had fueled the library for centuries began to dwindle. Emperors had little incentive to fund a potential center of dissent in a distant, albeit wealthy, province. The Mousillon, the research institute connected to the library, lost its state funding, its tax exemptions, and its prestige. Scholars were no longer drawn to Alexandria with the same magnetic pull. The city remained a hub of learning for a time, but its unique, state-sponsored preeminence was gone. The Roman gift, which once seemed like a new beginning, was in fact the final, brilliant flash of a fading light. The institution entered a long period of quiet, gradual decline, its corridors growing emptier, its influence waning. The beacon that had illuminated the ancient world for nearly 3 centuries was now overshadowed, its future uncertain as it passed from the hands of kings to the administrators of a foreign power. As the formal institutions of the library slowly receded from the center of civic life, the bustling streets of Alexandria became fertile ground for a new and potent force. It was an idea, carried on trade routes and whispered in marketplaces, that would fundamentally reshape the world: Christianity. According to tradition, the evangelist Mark brought the faith to the city in the 1st century AD, planting a seed in one of the most intellectually diverse environments on Earth. Alexandria was a crucible of beliefs. Here, the logic of Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle coexisted with the ancient mysticism of Egyptian deities. The rigid traditions of a large Jewish community mingled with the pantheon of Roman gods. Into this vibrant, chaotic mix, Christianity introduced a radical and uncompromising concept: one God, one scripture, and one path to salvation. For many, its message of hope and equality was deeply compelling, offering solace in a rigid and often unforgiving Roman world. At first, it was just one mystery cult among many, its followers a small and sometimes persecuted minority. But its roots ran deep, and its influence grew steadily. This new faith presented a profound ideological challenge to the very foundation upon which the library was built. The library and its associated schools represented a world of inquiry, debate, and the synthesis of knowledge from countless sources. It celebrated reason and observation. In contrast, the new theology emphasized faith and revelation. Early Christian thinkers in Alexandria, like Clement and Origen, were brilliant scholars who attempted to build a bridge between these two worlds. They studied Greek philosophy and used its logical frameworks to articulate Christian doctrine, arguing that reason could be a handmaiden to faith. For a time, it seemed a harmonious synthesis might be possible, but for a growing number of zealous adherents, this compromise was unacceptable. To them, the vast collections of pagan literature, the philosophies, the plays, the histories, were not treasures of human intellect, but dangerous relics of a misguided past. They were seen as distractions from the one true text, or worse, as invitations to heresy and idolatry. The tension was no longer just academic, it was spiritual and increasingly political. As the Christian community grew in size and organization, it transformed from a fringe movement into a powerful institution, capable of challenging the established order. The stage was being set for a monumental confrontation, not with swords and shields, but over the very nature of truth itself. The old world of pagan intellect, embodied by the legacy of the library, was on a collision course with a rising tide of faith that would redefine Western civilization. While the Great Library itself had faded into a state of diminished relevance, its vibrant spirit had been reborn in a second, even more magnificent location: the Serapeum. Perched atop the highest point in Alexandria, this colossal temple was not just a place of worship for the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, it was the city's new intellectual and cultural heart. Known as the Daughter Library, the Serapeum housed a vast collection of its own, with some estimates placing its holdings at over 40,000 scrolls. It was a public institution in a way the original Mouseion never was, its colonnades and reading rooms open to the citizens, a bustling hub of philosophy, science, and literature. For generations, it stood as a proud symbol of Alexandria's enduring intellectual legacy. But by the late 4th century, the world had changed irrevocably. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I declared Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The old ways were no longer tolerated, they were targeted. Paganism was now officially outlawed. Temples were viewed as monuments to false idols, their rituals condemned, their existence an affront to the new order. The Serapeum, with its towering statue of the hybrid god Serapis and its priceless repository of classical, pagan knowledge, became the ultimate symbol of the old world that had to be swept away. The simmering animosity between Alexandria's pagan and Christian populations was about to reach its boiling point. The city was a powder keg of religious tension, with frequent street brawls and public confrontations. The Serapeum, the last great bastion of pagan intellectualism, became the flashpoint. In 391 AD, a minor dispute over the discovery of pagan artifacts in a ruined temple escalated into widespread civic unrest. The city's pagan community, led by the philosopher Olympius, found themselves vastly outnumbered. In a desperate act, they retreated to the most defensible position they had, the massive, fortified complex of the Serapeum. They barred the great bronze doors, transforming the sanctuary of knowledge into a fortress. From its walls, they launched attacks on the Christian population below, holding the temple as their last stand. The siege began. Outside, a furious crowd gathered, their anger stoked by zealous leaders. Inside, scholars and priests guarded their sacred texts, trapped and surrounded, hoping for reason to prevail. The fate of the last great library of the ancient world now rested not on the wisdom within its walls, but on the verdict of an emperor hundreds of miles away. As the pagan defenders held their ground within the Serapeum, a formidable figure orchestrated the movement against them. This was Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria. He was a man of immense ambition and unyielding conviction, a master of both theological argument and political maneuvering. To Theophilus, the standoff at the Serapeum was more than a religious dispute. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the church and his own control over the city. He saw an opportunity to permanently break the back of pagan influence in his domain. He immediately dispatched a message to the Emperor Theodosius I in Constantinople, framing the situation as an insurrection by defiant pagans against imperial law. Theodosius, known for his piety and his aggressive anti-pagan policies, did not hesitate. His response arrived in Alexandria with the full weight of imperial authority. The decree was a masterstroke of political calculation. It offered a full pardon to the pagans for their violent acts, thus preventing them from becoming martyrs. But its second clause was devastating. It commanded the complete and utter demolition of the Serapeum itself. The temple, the decree implied, was the source of the conflict and had to be removed. For the Christian crowd waiting outside, the reading of the imperial letter was a moment of absolute triumph, a sign of divine and imperial favor. For the defenders inside, the news was the final, crushing blow. Their world was about to be dismantled. Theophilus himself reportedly took the first swing, striking the monumental statue of Serapis with an axe. This symbolic act broke the spell of the old god's power. The crowd, now a sanctioned demolition crew, surged forward. The magnificent statue, a masterpiece of ancient art, was pulled down, broken into pieces, and dragged through the streets. Then, they turned their attention to the library's contents. While some accounts suggest a great fire, it is more likely the destruction was methodical. Scrolls were torn, scattered, and repurposed. The intellectual treasures of generations were treated as mere refuse of a superseded age. The building itself was systematically taken apart, its stones later used to build a church on the same site, a final, powerful symbol of the new faith's victory over the old. The demolition of the Serapeum in 391 AD was not a random act of mob violence. It was a state-sanctioned eradication of a cultural and religious center. The last great public library of Alexandria was gone. Yet, even in the shadow of its ruins, a single, brilliant mind continued to teach the old ways, a final keeper of a dying flame. In the first years of the 5th century, in a city still reeling from the destruction of the Serapeum, one voice of reason rose above the partisan clamor. It was the voice of a woman, a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer of breathtaking intellect, Hypatia. As the daughter of Theon, himself a renowned scholar and the last attested member of the Mouseion, Hypatia was the direct intellectual heir to the legacy of the Great Library. She was a leading figure in the Neoplatonic school of philosophy, which sought to understand the universe through reason and mathematics. Her lectures, delivered from her home to a devoted circle of students, were legendary. They attracted the brightest young minds from across the empire, including Christians, pagans, and Jews, all drawn by her charisma and the clarity of her thought. Hypatia was more than an academic. She was a major public figure, respected for her wisdom and civic virtue. She became a close friend and trusted advisor to the city's Roman governor, Orestes. This secular influence placed her in direct opposition to the city's new, powerful church leader, Cyril, who had succeeded his uncle Theophilus as patriarch in 412 AD. Cyril was as ambitious as his uncle, and even more intolerant of any authority that challenged his own. He viewed Hypatia's close relationship with Orestes with deep suspicion, seeing her as the intellectual force behind the governor's resistance to the church's growing political power. A sinister campaign of rumors began to circulate through the city's parishes. Cyril's most radical followers, a group of monks known as the Parabolani, began to publicly denounce Hypatia. They twisted her scientific inquiries into accusations of sorcery, claiming she used dark arts to bewitch the governor and turn him against the true faith. The political tension between Cyril and Orestes reached a fever pitch, with Hypatia caught in the perilous space between them. The city became a tinderbox of religious fanaticism. In the spring of 415 AD, during the season of Lent, the carefully cultivated hostility exploded. As Hypatia was traveling through the city in her chariot, she was ambushed by a mob incited by the relentless propaganda. They dragged her from her carriage, their minds poisoned by the lies they had been told. The group took her to a recently converted church, a building that was once a temple to the Caesars. Inside that building, the mob carried out a brutal act of violence. The passing of Hypatia was not just a horrific event, it was a profound symbol. With her, the last living link to the classical tradition of rational inquiry in Alexandria was severed. The light of philosophy, which had burned for over 700 years, was finally and tragically put out. By the 4th century, Alexandria was no longer the serene intellectual haven of the Ptolemies. It was a metropolis fractured by deep and volatile divisions. The old world of pagan philosophy and the new, ascendant force of Christianity were locked in a struggle for the soul of the Roman Empire, and Alexandria was their battlefield. The Great Library itself was likely a shadow of its former glory, but its spirit, and a vast collection of scrolls, lived on in its magnificent daughter institution, the Serapeum. This temple, dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, was more than a place of worship. It was a university, a sanctuary of classical learning, and the last great bastion of pagan intellectual life. Its colonnades and lecture halls echoed with the teachings of Aristotle and Plato, a defiant continuation of a tradition that now seemed increasingly at odds with the times. The tension was palpable in the city's streets, where rival mobs clashed and theological disputes were settled with brute force. In 391 AD, this simmering conflict reached its boiling point. The Christian patriarch, Theophilus, a man of immense ambition and unyielding conviction, saw the Serapeum not as a treasure of knowledge, but as a symbol of idolatry that had to be eradicated. He obtained a decree from Emperor Theodosius I, authorizing the demolition of pagan temples throughout the city. For the scholars and philosophers within the Serapeum, this was not merely a political edict, it was an existential threat. They were the custodians of centuries of human thought, the keepers of a flame that had burned since the age of Aristotle. They barricaded themselves inside the temple complex, transforming the home of the Muses into a fortress. The standoff began, a desperate last stand for an entire worldview. The collection housed within the Serapeum was immense, containing copies and original works that rivaled the old Mouseion. It held the heritage of Greece and the wisdom of Egypt. As Theophilus's followers gathered outside, their chants growing louder, the scholars inside must have looked upon the countless scrolls with a sense of profound dread. Each papyrus represented a unique voice from the past, a piece of the human story. They were not just defending a building, they were defending the very memory of mankind. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the fate of the last great library of the ancient world hanging precariously in the balance. The story of the Library of Alexandria's end is often told as a single, cataclysmic event, one great fire that consumed the totality of ancient knowledge. This dramatic image, while powerful, obscures a more complex and protracted reality. The library did not die in a day. It suffered a series of devastating blows over the course of 7 centuries, a slow and agonizing decline. The first major incident occurred in 48 BC. During Julius Caesar's occupation of Alexandria, a fire he set to destroy enemy ships in the harbor spread uncontrollably to the docks and parts of the city. Ancient writers claim that warehouses containing scrolls, perhaps intended for export or part of the library's collection, were consumed. While this was a significant loss, it was not a fatal one. The institution survived, and the work of collecting and copying continued. A far more targeted and ideologically driven event was the confrontation at the Serapeum in 391 AD. Following the imperial decree, the Christian mob led by Patriarch Theophilus stormed the temple complex. The scholars inside were overwhelmed. The structure was systematically dismantled, its sacred objects removed, and its intellectual purpose extinguished. While historical accounts focus on the building's ruin, the fate of its scrolls is less clear. Some may have been relocated, others taken by private individuals, but it is certain that a vast and invaluable collection was scattered and effectively lost to the world. This event marked the end of the library as a public, state-sponsored institution of pagan learning. The final and most legendary chapter in its destruction is set in 642 AD during the Muslim conquest of Egypt. According to a story written centuries later, the conquering general, Amr ibn al-As, asked the Caliph Omar what to do with the books. The Caliph supposedly replied, "If what is written in them agrees with the Quran, they are not required. If it disagrees, they are not desired. Destroy them." The tale concludes that the scrolls were used as fuel to heat the city's 4,000 bathhouses for 6 months. However, most modern historians view this account with deep skepticism. It appears to be a piece of later propaganda, as contemporary sources make no mention of such a grand act of destruction. By the 7th century, the great institution was already a memory. Its demise was not a singular inferno, but a gradual erosion caused by political strife, budget cuts, ideological shifts, and neglect. The final silence fell not with a roar, but with a whisper. Though the great institution in Alexandria was gone, its intellectual spirit refused to vanish completely. Knowledge, once written down, is a resilient thing. It can be copied, translated, and transported. As the lights dimmed in Alexandria, sparks of its brilliance were carried away by intellectual refugees, creating new centers of learning far from the shores of Egypt. The fall of the Serapeum and the city's growing instability prompted an exodus of scholars. They traveled east, seeking patronage and safety in cities like Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and further into Persia. In the Sasanian Empire, the city of Gundashapur became a remarkable intellectual melting pot, welcoming scholars from Greek, Jewish, Christian, and Indian traditions. Here, the medical and philosophical texts saved from Alexandria were not merely stored, they were actively studied and debated. A crucial role in this transmission was played by Nestorian Christians. Often considered heretics by the Byzantine establishment, they fled eastward, taking with them a rich tradition of Greek learning. They established schools and monasteries throughout Syria and Mesopotamia, where they began the monumental task of translating the great works of Greek science, medicine, and philosophy. Figures like Galen, Ptolemy, and Aristotle, first into Syriac and later into Arabic. When the Islamic Golden Age dawned in the 8th century, the Abbasid caliphs in their new capital of Baghdad showed an insatiable appetite for this preserved knowledge. They established the House of Wisdom, an institution that consciously echoed the ambitions of Alexandria's Mouseion. Scholars were paid their weight in gold to translate the ancient texts into Arabic. Through this channel, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy, and the logic of Aristotle were absorbed, assimilated, and expanded upon by brilliant Arab and Persian thinkers. The Library of Alexandria, in a sense, was reborn. It was no longer a single building, but a decentralized network of texts and ideas, alive in a new language and culture. These Arabic translations were the bridge across which classical knowledge would eventually travel back to a Europe mired in its own dark ages. The whispers of Alexandria, carried on the winds of change, had found a new voice, ensuring that the quest for understanding would continue, even in the absence of its greatest temple. While we celebrate the knowledge that was saved, we must also confront the staggering scale of what was lost. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria represents one of the greatest intellectual catastrophes in human history. It created a void in our collective memory, a phantom limb of knowledge whose absence we can still feel today. What exactly did we lose? We lost entire fields of inquiry. We know that Aristarchus of Samos argued for a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus, but his primary treatise on the subject, which was housed in the library, is gone. How might our understanding of the cosmos have been different if his work had survived and been studied? We lost history itself. The library held the comprehensive 3-volume history of Babylon by the priest Berossus, and the complete annals of ancient Egypt by the historian Manetho. Today, we have only fragments and summaries of their work, quoted by later authors. We are left to guess at the dynasties, discoveries, and daily lives they so meticulously recorded. The loss to literature is incalculable. We know the names of dozens of great playwrights, but possess only a fraction of their output. Sophocles is said to have written over 120 plays. Only 7 survive. Of Aeschylus's estimated 90 plays, we also have just 7. The library contained the complete works of these masters, along with countless other poems, epics, and comedies that are now nothing more than titles in an ancient catalogue. Beyond specific books, we lost a methodology. The Alexandrian scholars were pioneers of critical analysis, textual criticism, and empirical science. They collected vast amounts of astronomical data, performed medical dissections, and created sophisticated mechanical devices, including, some say, a primitive steam engine designed by Hero of Alexandria. The loss of their records and research notes may have set back technological and scientific progress by centuries. This was not just a collection of books, it was the accumulated data and wisdom of the ancient world. Its disappearance forced humanity to rediscover what was already known, to redraw maps that had already been charted, and to relearn the fundamental laws of the universe. The silence from the library's empty shelves echoes through the centuries, a constant reminder of the fragility of knowledge and the immense cost of its neglect. For over 1,600 years, the Library of Alexandria existed only as a powerful idea, a symbol of universal knowledge and a cautionary tale of its loss. But at the end of the 20th century, an ambitious dream began to take shape on the same shoreline where the ancient beacon once stood. The dream of its rebirth. The project to build a new Library of Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, was a monumental undertaking, born from a desire to recapture the spirit of the original. It was a joint effort between the Egyptian government and UNESCO, a global collaboration that mirrored the international character of its ancient predecessor. An architectural competition drew entries from around the world, but it was a stunning design by the Norwegian firm Snohetta that was chosen to bring the vision to life. Opened in 2002, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a masterpiece of modern design, rich with symbolism. Its main structure is a vast, tilted disc, evoking the image of the rising sun, a new dawn of knowledge for the world. The building is partially submerged in a pool of water, connecting it to the Mediterranean, the ancient highway of ideas. Its immense, curving outer wall is carved from granite, inscribed with characters and alphabets from over 120 different human scripts, declaring its commitment to global culture and dialogue from the moment a visitor approaches. Inside, the main reading room is a breathtaking terraced space, capable of holding 8 million volumes, cascading downwards under the angled roof that bathes the entire area in natural light. But this new institution is more than just a repository for books. It is a sprawling cultural complex, housing museums, art galleries, a planetarium, and research centers specializing in everything from manuscript restoration to information sciences. It is a hub for digital knowledge, home to a complete, searchable archive of the early internet. The mission of the new Bibliotheca is not to recreate the past, but to embody its founding principles in a modern context, to be a center for learning, tolerance, and understanding between cultures. It stands as a testament to the enduring power of the human quest for knowledge. It is a promise to the future that the flame ignited so long ago will never again be allowed to go out. On the coast of Alexandria, a beacon of learning once again shines brightly for all the world,